Good evening. My name is BVJ, and welcome to Bedtime Stories with BVJ. This is the show where we get you ready for a good night's sleep with stories you've heard before, but maybe not in a good long while. Public domain short stories for kids and adults to enjoy. You can follow along as we read at twitch.tv/BigVoiceJ. Tonight's story is The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde. Every afternoon as they were coming from school, the children used to go and to play in the giant's garden. It was a large, lovely garden with soft green grass. Here and there over the grass stood beautiful flowers, like stars, and there were 12 peach trees that in the springtime broke out into delicate blossoms of pink and pearl, and in the autumn bore rich fruit. The birds sat on the trees and sang so sweetly that the children used to stop their games in order to listen to them. "How happy we are here," they cried to each other. One day, the giant came back. He had been to visit his friend, the Cornish ogre, and had stayed with him for 7 years. After the 7 years were over, he had said all that he had to say, for his conversation was limited, and he determined to return to his own castle. When he arrived, he saw the children playing in the garden. "What are you doing here?" he cried in a very gruff voice, and the children ran away. "My own garden is my own garden," said the giant. "Anyone can understand that, and I will not allow anyone to play in it but myself." So he built a high wall all around it and put up a notice board. "Trespassers will be prosecuted." He was a very selfish giant. The poor children now had nowhere to play. They tried to play on the road, but the road was very dusty and full of hard stones, and they did not like it. They used to wander around the high wall when their lessons were over and talk about the beautiful garden inside. "How happy we were there," they said to each other. Then the spring came. All over the country, there were little blossoms and little birds. Only in the garden of the selfish giant, it was still winter. The birds did not care to sing in it, as there were no children, and the trees forgot to blossom. Once a beautiful flower put its head out from the grass, but when it saw the notice board, it was so sorry for the children that it slipped back into the ground and went off to sleep. The only people who were pleased were the snow and the frost. "Spring has forgotten this garden," they cried, "so we will live here all the year round." The snow covered up the grass with a great white cloak, and the frost painted all the trees silver. Then they invited the north wind to stay with them, and he came. He was wrapped in furs, and he roared all day about the garden and blew the chimney pots down. "This is a delightful spot," he said. "We must ask the hail on a visit." So the hail came every day for 3 hours. He rattled on the roof of the castle till he broke most of the slates. And then he ran round and round the garden as fast as he could go. He was dressed in gray, and his breath was like ice. "I cannot understand why this spring is so late in coming," said the selfish giant, as he sat at the window and looked out at the cold white garden. "I hope there will be a change in the weather." But the spring never came, nor the summer. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden, but to the giant's garden she gave none. "He is too selfish," she said. So it was always winter there, and the north wind, and the hail, and the frost, and the snow danced about the trees. One morning the giant was lying awake in bed when he heard some lovely music. It sounded so sweet to his ears that he thought it must be the king's musicians passing by. It was really only a little linnet singing outside his window, but it was so long since he had heard a bird sing in his garden that it seemed to him to be the most beautiful music in the world. Then the hail stopped dancing over his head, and the north wind ceased roaring, and a delicious perfume came to him through the open casement. "I believe the spring has come at last," said the giant. He jumped out of bed and looked out. What did he see? He saw a most wonderful sight. Through a little hole in the wall, the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the branches of the trees. In every tree that he could see, there was a little child. And the trees were so glad to have the children back again that they had covered themselves with blossoms and were waving their arms gently above the children's heads. The birds were flying about and twittering with delight, and the flowers were looking up through the green grass and laughing. It was a lovely scene, only in one corner was still winter. It was the farthest corner of the garden, and in it was standing a little boy. He was so small that he could not reach up to the branches of the tree, and he was wandering all round it, crying bitterly. The poor tree was still quite covered with frost and snow, and the north wind was blowing and roaring above it. "Climb up, little boy," said the tree, and it bent its branches down as low as it could, but the boy was too tiny. And the giant's heart melted as he looked out. "How selfish I have been," he said. "Now I know why the spring would not come here. I will put that poor little boy on the top of the tree, and then I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground forever and ever." He was really, really very sorry for what he had done. So he crept downstairs and opened the front door quite softly and went out into the garden. But when the children saw him, they were so frightened that they all ran away, and the garden became winter again. Only the little boy did not run, for his eyes were so full of tears that he did not see the giant coming. And the giant stole up behind him and took him gently in his hand and put him up into the tree. And the tree broke at once into blossom, and the birds came and sang on it. And the little boy stretched out his 2 arms and flung them round the giant's neck and kissed him. And the other children, when they saw that the giant was not wicked any longer, came running back, and with them came the spring. "It is your garden now, little children," said the giant. And he took a great axe and knocked down the wall. And when the people were going to market at 12 o'clock, they found the giant playing with the children in the most beautiful garden they had ever seen. All day long they played, and in the evening they came to the giant to bid him goodbye. "But where's your little companion?" he said. "The boy I put into the tree. The giant loved him the best because he had kissed him." "We don't know," answered the children. "He has gone away." "You must tell him to be sure and come here tomorrow," said the giant. But the children said that they did not know where he lived and had never seen him before. And the giant felt very sad. Every afternoon when school was over, the children came and played with the giant. But the little boy whom the giant loved was never seen again. The giant was very kind to all the children, yet he longed for his first little friend and often spoke of him. "How I would like to see him," he would say. Years went over, and the giant grew very old and feeble. He could not play about anymore, so he sat in a huge armchair and watched the children at their games and admired his garden. "I have many beautiful flowers," he said, "but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all." One winter morning he looked out of his window as he was dressing. He did not hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep, and that the flowers were resting. Suddenly he rubbed his eyes in wonder, and looked and looked. It certainly was a marvelous sight. In the farthest corner of the garden was a tree quite covered with lovely white blossoms. Its branches were golden and silver that hung down from them, and underneath it stood the little boy he had loved. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy, and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child. And when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, so that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are the wounds of love." "Who art thou?" said the giant, and a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled to the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. Well, there's something to get your night started. I would say that you would need to open up your heart and let the sunshine in, but the sunshine will kill you, apparently. So don't. Get yourself a great security system so you can see all the children trying to come into your yard, and you can deal with them accordingly. Great place. You can go to simplysafe.com and code BVJ in the promo code, and it'll do absolutely nothing because this is not sponsored. But I would like you to go to bedtimewithbvj.com and give us a good old like and a review. Use whatever number of stars you like. But be sure you tell everybody, we're out here. We're making people fall asleep. Our next story is Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. Once there was a miller who was poor, but who had a beautiful daughter. Now it appeared that he had to go and speak to the king, and in order to make himself appear important, he said to him, "I have a daughter who could spin straw into gold." The king said to the miller, "That is an art which pleases me well. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her tomorrow to my palace, and I will try what she can do." And when the girl was brought to him, he took her into a room which was quite full of straw. He gave her a spinning wheel and a reel and said, "Now, set to work, and if by tomorrow morning early you have not spun this straw into gold during the night, you must die." Thereupon he himself locked up the room and left her in it alone. So there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for the life of her could not tell what to do. She had no idea the straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more miserable, until at last she began to weep. But all at once the door opened, and in came a little man, who said, "Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?" "Alas," answered the girl, "I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it." "What will you give me?" said the mannikin, "if I do it for you?" "My necklace," said the girl. The little man took the necklace, seated himself in front of the wheel, and whir, whir, whir. 3 turns and the reel was full. And then he put another on, and whir, 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 3 times round, and the second was full too. And so it went on until the morning, when all the straw was spun, and all the reels were full of gold. By daybreak the king was already there, and when he saw the gold he was astonished and delighted, but his heart only became more greedy. He had the miller's daughter taken into another room full of straw, which was much larger, and commanded her to spin that also in one night if she valued her life. The girl knew not how to help herself and was crying, when the door again opened, and the little man appeared and said, "What will you give me if I spin that straw into gold for you?" "The ring on my finger," answered the girl. The little man took the ring, again began to turn the wheel, and by morning had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king rejoiced beyond measure at the sight, but still he had not gold enough, and he had the miller's daughter taken into a still larger room full of straw, and said, "You must spin this too in the course of this night. But if you succeed, you shall be my wife." Even if she be a miller's daughter, thought he, I could not find a richer wife in the whole world. When the girl was alone, the mannikin came again for the 3rd time and said, "What will you give me if I spin the straw for you this time also?" "I have nothing left that I could give," said the girl. "Then promise me, if you should become queen, your first child." "Who knows whether that will ever happen," thought the miller's daughter, and not knowing how else to help herself in this situation, she promised the mannikin what she wanted. And for that, he once more spun the straw into gold. And when the king came in the morning and found all as he had wished, he took her in marriage, and the pretty miller's daughter became a queen. A year later, she had a beautiful child, and she never gave a thought to the mannikin. But suddenly he came into her room and said, "Now give me what you promised." The queen was horror-struck and offered the mannikin all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her the child. But the mannikin said, "No, something that is living is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world." Then the queen began to weep and cry, so that the mannikin pitied her. "I will give you 3 days' time," said he. "If by that time you find out my name, then you shall keep your child." So the queen thought the whole night of all the names that she had ever heard, and she sent a messenger over the country to inquire far and wide for any other names that there might be. When the mannequin came the next day, she began with Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and said all the names she knew, one after another. But to every little one, the little man said, "That is not my name." On the second day, she had inquiries made in the neighborhood as to the names of the people there, and she repeated to the mannequin the most uncommon and curious. "Perhaps your name is Short Ribs, or Sheepshanks, or Lace Leg." But he always answered, "That is not my name." On the third day, the messenger came back again and said, "I have not been able to find a single new name, but as I came to a high mountain at the end of the forest where the fox and the hare bid each other good night, there I saw a little house, and before the house a fire was burning, and round about the fire quite a ridiculous little man was jumping. He hopped upon one leg and shouted, 'Today I bake, tomorrow brew. The next I'll have the young queen's child. Ha! Glad am I that knew that Rumpelstiltskin I am styled.' You may think how glad the queen was when she heard the name, and when soon afterwards the little man came in and asked, 'Now, Mistress Queen, what is my name?' At first she said, 'Is your name Comrade?' 'No.' 'Is your name Harry?' 'No.' 'Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin.' 'The devil has told you that! The devil has told you that!' cried the little man. And in his anger, he plunged his right foot so deep into the earth that his whole leg went in, and then in rage he pulled at his left leg so hard with both hands that he tore himself in two. So what do we learn from this little story? The thing that jumped out to me, and it's just me talking here, is knowledge is power. And if someone has knowledge, they can bleed you dry to get it. If you need to know something and you don't know where it is, and you're dependent on other people, then they have you right where they want you. You don't want that. Get some knowledge into your life. Try Masterclass at masterclass.com. And a code BVJ in the promo code. And it'll do absolutely nothing because this is not a sponsored read. I would, however, like you to go to twitch.tv/BigVoiceJ and give us a like, maybe a subscribe. We appreciate it. Our next story is Rapunzel by the Brothers Grimm. There was once a man and a woman who had long in vain wished for a child. At length the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. These people had a little window at the back of their house, from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it because it belonged to an enchantress, who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden, where she saw a bed, which was planted with the most beautiful rampion, Rapunzel, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it and had the greatest desire to eat some. This desire increased every day, and as she knew that she could not get any of it, she quite pined away and looked pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed and asked, "What aileth thee, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't get some of the rampion, which is in the garden behind our house, to eat, I shall die." The man who loved her thought, "Sooner than let my wife die, bring her some of the rampion thyself. Let it cost thee what it will." In the twilight of the evening he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of rampion, and took it to his wife. She had once made herself a salad of it, and ate it with much relish. She, however, liked it so much, so very much, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into that garden. In the gloom of evening, therefore, he let himself down again, but when he had clambered down the wall, he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How canst thou dare," said she with an angry look, "to descend into my garden and steal my rampion like a thief? Thou shalt suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your rampion from the window and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened, and said to him, "If the case be as thou sayest, I will allow thee to take away with what shall be as much rampion as thou wilt. Only I make one condition. Thou must give me the child which thy wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man in his terror consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child beneath the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower which lay in a forest and had neither stairs nor door. But quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 ells down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or two, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and went by the tower. And he heard a song which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once, when he was standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I will for once try my fortune," said he. And the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Immediately the hair fell down, and the king's son climbed up. At first, Rapunzel was terribly frightened, when a man such as her eyes had never yet beheld came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for a husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gothel does." And she said yes, and laid her hand in his. She said, "I will willingly go away with thee, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with thee a skein of silk every time that thou comest, and I will weave a ladder with it, and when that is ready, I will descend, and thou wilt take me on thy horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, while the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said, "Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah, thou wicked child!" cried the enchantress. "What do I hear thee say? I thought I had separated thee from all the world, and yet thou hast deceived me." In her anger, she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful tresses, wrapped them twice around her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right. Snip, snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. And she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert, where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day, however, that she cast out Rapunzel, the enchantress in the evening fastened the braids of hair, which she had cut off, to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," she let the hair down. The king's son ascended, but did not find his dearest Rapunzel above, but the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and venomous looks. "Aha!" cried mockingly. "Thou wouldst fetch thy dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it, and will scratch out thy eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to thee. Thou wilt never see her more." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but rods and berries, and did nothing but lament and weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at length came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it, and when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes, and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom, where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented. Say, do you think maybe during dinner one day, maybe during a private moment, the prince asked Rapunzel, "Who's catching these again? I know you had twins, but I thought you were out here in the desert and I don't know what's going on." Ah, shower thoughts. But that's for another day. That's for other people to argue about. If you have an idea, you can email me, bigvoicej@gmail.com. Those are the ends of tonight's stories. Do you want more? Do you have a story you'd like to read? You can email me, bigvoicej@gmail.com. Remember to subscribe to the podcast at bedtimewithbvj.com. Thanks for listening. Good night.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.